We are Knowledge Rights 21. We are run out of IFLA. We work closely with a number of other library associations, including LIBA Europe and also Spark Europe. And we are funded by the Arcadia Foundation. And what we do is we work across Europe for legislative and regulatory change to support the needs of research, education, and libraries. A warm welcome to everybody today. I think this will be a fascinating presentation. First of all, I'd like to introduce our speakers, or perhaps our speaker, and then colleagues who are part of the team. First of all, Eoin O'Dell, who is Associate Professor of Law at Trinity College, will present the background and the relationship with where we are today and the bill. And I would like to warmly welcome also his team, Arushi Sharma, who is a researcher at Trinity College specializing in IT law, and Knowledge Rights 21 Irish member Martin Bradley, who you can't see on the screen but is in the audience. Today's presentation is an interesting development. We now have something like 8 laws across Europe which allow, as it's called in Scandinavia, parallel publishing of publicly funded research materials. Those laws take different forms. Most are what are called secondary publishing rights, and some are more author retention type laws. So authors have the right to keep any publicly the authors have the rights to keep the copyright in any article which they authored that has been publicly funded, and therefore by implication they can then put it in an open access repository. The secondary publishing rights are more of an obligation to put publicly funded research in an open access repository. With no further ado, I will hand over to Eoin. You're muted, Eoin.
That's probably the best part of my presentation. Anyway, so thank you very much, Ben. That's very kind of you to introduce. Let me share. And our group, you'll see the names and the title on the screen, is a backronym: Secondary Rights, Copyright, Open Access, Institutional Policies, and Rights Retention, because these were the issues that we thought we were going to be covering. And the group is me, and I'm presenting on behalf of the group. And the balance of responsibility here is this: everybody else takes all the credit and I take all the blame. On this particular aspect, I spent a lot of time bouncing things off Arushi, who you've already introduced, and Martin, whom we've already introduced. But the others on the group as well are Francis Madden from Technological University of Dublin, Niamh Brennan, and Kaberi Basu, also from Trinity. And the reason why we created this backronym SCOIR is because SCOIR is the Irish word for unharness, and this project aims to unharness the power of open research by means, as you say, of proposing legislation. And the presentation today is about our draft, and we keep insisting this is a draft. Even though I thought I was finished, I found a typo last night. So it's still a draft: Research Outputs and Open Access Bill 2025. And across the bottom, you will see references to the Government of Ireland and the Higher Education Authority, and then to NORF and Knowledge Rights 21. But first, as they say in all old television programs, a word from our sponsors. The National Open Research Forum is an Irish funding body, funded ultimately by the Higher Education Authority, and Knowledge Rights 21, about which I need to say no more to this audience. Nor do I need to spend very long on why we are in favor of open access. There are all sorts of good reasons in terms of good reasons for researchers, exposure and citation and so on, good reasons for other researchers finding the research, whether they are here or abroad, and value for the taxpayers' money, because we're primarily talking today about publicly funded open research. So what is the main approach in the Research Outputs and Open Access Bill 2025? I like the Scandinavian thinking about this, that it's parallel publishing, and that's effectively what we're thinking about here. We're thinking about publishing and obligations parallel to all of the existing copyright publishers and so on. And it's a very short bill. As you can see, it is a bill of 10 sections of varying length. The first 3 are boilerplate in terms of introducing the bill, the clauses that will interpret important provisions later on, orders made under the bill. And the key provisions are provisions 4, 5, and 6, sections 4, 5, and 6, which I'm going to talk about for about 10 or 15 minutes. And then I'll briefly mention some of the other provisions as well. And it interoperates with about 15 other pieces of legislation. So it's not the most extensive in terms of length, but in terms of the amount of time that Arushi and Martin and I have been kicking phrases around, it's extensive in that sense. The key provision, and there's a key in the top right-hand corner, so that you understand that it's the key provision, is section 4, which deals with research outputs. And in the case of research outputs that are publicly funded in whole or in part, I should pause here to say that publicly funded might be an important term, but in previous legislation, the government has chosen not to define it. And since we're not going to do the government's job for them, or more to the point, what we want to do is to interoperate as much as possible with other pieces of legislation. We're simply saying if they haven't defined it in other similar pieces of legislation, we're going to leave it as general as possible here too. So in the case of a research output that is publicly funded, the employer of the author of the research output shall make or cause to make the research output available to the public by means of an open repository. And we've got a definition of open repository and a definition of research output in our definition section, which I will come back to, but that is the starting point. Publicly funded research output, the employer shall make or cause to make the research available by means of an open repository. So we're not saying you have to retain rights and you have to work on foot of the retained rights. We're not saying that this is a secondary publishing right. We're simply saying there's a workflow that has to be established in parallel to all of the existing legislation whereby the author's employer ensures publication. If it's a jointly authored paper, then any employer of any of the authors can. And then if the employers don't, one of the ways to ensure that you do get widespread publication is that joint authors or funders may make the publication available. And they may do this even if it is made available in other places. And in the case of any other work, which is to say anything that isn't a publicly funded research output funded and published after the coming into effect of the Act, if the employer has already made a workflow available, then that workflow may be used for any other work to ensure that that other work can also be published by means of an open repository. So the two key things here are these. Publicly funded, the employer shall make it available. Any other research outputs or other works, if there is a workflow there, you can use that workflow to publish it as well. And then section 4, subsection 3 creates an equivalent workflow for self-employed researchers. There are not that many, but I can think of examples of independent consultants who do research and publish the research for government departments. And so a similar workflow is created there. The research outputs may be published or republished, used or reused for any lawful purpose. they shall be assigned a DOI. They shall be provided with metadata by the repository, and they shall be interoperable in an open format and on foot of a suitable open public license. Now, in a parallel situation, there already are rules relating to open public licenses, so we have simply adopted those rules, and the effect of those rules is that the publicly funded research is to be made available by means of a suitable Creative Commons license or other suitable open public license. There are lots of open access repositories, and you can argue that some of these are and some of these aren't, but at least there are lots of examples out there of open access repositories, in particular in Ireland, where the National Open Research Forum, which is funding us, is funding a research project on open access repositories. And then we have our general digital repository of Ireland, and there are others as well. So these are the numbers of open access repositories in Europe generally. And as you can see, there are some countries with a lot, like Germany has 790 and Ireland has 42, but at least we have 42. And that means that there is quite a good range on foot of which our publications might be made available on open access. Now, an open repository, as I said, we have a precise definition, means a robust, sustainable, trusted online storage and retrieval platform where research outputs and other works are stored and preserved without charge or payment to the party depositing the research output or other work, and made available to the public without charge. So the aim here is to try and capture what a real open repository is, so that you don't get an argument that having some kind of, I don't know, Google Drive somewhere amounts to an open repository. So we're trying to capture robust, sustainable, trusted online storage and retrieval where such works are stored, preserved, made available. What's research? Well, research and output have definitions. We already have a definition of research in a recent piece of legislation establishing our general Irish Research Agency, Taida Éireann. I am not going to play PowerPoint karaoke and sing it. I'm just telling you we have a definition of research. And we have created a definition of output. Outputs are works that are produced in research contexts and intended by their author or joint authors primarily to further the purposes and interests of the research contexts. And this is important because it allows us to draw lines between things that might be produced in those contexts but aren't research, and it turns on the primacy of the intention of the author. Let's have an example. In Trinity, we have an Arts and Humanities Research Institute, the Long Room Hub, and we have various artists and writers and fellows in residence. And two of our writers in residence at the moment are Mark O'Connell and Paul Murray. O'Connell has written a really interesting book called A Thread of Violence, and Paul Murray was runner-up in the recent Booker Prize for the Bee Sting, and I think he was robbed. But anyway, so we have two writers in residence, and they make their living by publishing their journalism, their short stories, their novels. And the question is whether those outputs are research outputs, given that they are in that building on the right-hand side there in Fellow Square in Trinity. And the answer is no. And the answer is no for three reasons, two of which are on the screen. The first is that they are not intended by their authors primarily to further the academic research interests. We are providing them with a location in which to do their work, but we are primarily simply assisting them in their work. And their work is not research as it is defined in the Irish legislation. It's not undertaken to increase the stock of knowledge and to devise new applications of available knowledge. And therefore, work like that, even though produced in educational institutions, is not research outputs. And the Arts Council, which is one of our primary public funders of arts and other creative outputs, has funded writers in residence. And one of the writers in residence they have funded is the woman in the middle, who is a writer in residence in Maynooth, a university not far from here. And she had been a writer in residence in Trinity. And this is her just now published novel. I'm looking forward to reading it. But that wouldn't count for the reasons I've just given, but also because one of our sections, having set up Section 4, publicly funded research outputs, we have excluded publicly funded artistic works. So a publicly funded artistic work shall not constitute a research output only because it was publicly funded or undertaken in a higher education institution. And echoing the definition that a publicly funded research output has to be intended by its funder or author. Usually the funders here, like the Higher Education Authority, like the Arts Council, will not intend what they're funding to be research outputs. But just in case one of the people that I've just mentioned decided that they wanted to produce a research output whilst in Trinity, well, then they can. And it can then be published in an open repository in the normal way under this bill. We have also clarified how far the obligation goes on the part of the author, the funder, and importantly, the employer of the author to make a publicly funded research output available in an open repository. There are some exceptions, limitations, and postponements. If there is another legal rule that says you can't publish, so the GDPR has significant rules around personal data, for example. And then there are rules around patents and trade secrets and when you can't publish. So if there's a rule of law out there that says, oh, I don't know, if you publish this, this is an official secret and we will lock you up and throw away the key, well, then you don't publish. This bill does not override national security. There are limitations for IP rights, but those IP rights don't prevent publication where there are no exceptions or where there is no practicable license. And there are some postponements, and this is something that requires individual cases to be made. So this, whilst the exceptions and limitations are general, postponements are individual. I have something that falls into one of these categories that I think shouldn't be immediately published, that there should be a postponement. Then I have to make an individual case to my Dean of Research, Vice President for Research, that there is an imperative reason of overriding public interest, and the postponement of publication will be only for so long as is strictly necessary to satisfy that reason. I still have to deposit in the repository, but the Dean of Research can say, but it doesn't need to be switched on, if you like, made publicly available, for so long as the imperative reason overriding public interest applies. And imperative reasons are, this language is deliberately strong. Imperative reasons of overriding public interest. It's a phrase from the Court of Justice, which the Court of Justice uses a lot, but it is also meant to be clear that we're just talking about an exception or a limitation or a postponement on a general right, and therefore it should be interpreted narrowly. But the kinds of things that might be imperative reasons are national security, academic freedom, ethical obligations, the necessary aims of the research project if it's ongoing, and exceptional nature of a significant and sizable research output. For example, a monograph where immediate open access publication of the monograph would significantly impact on academic interests of the author. These are all phrases or concepts that have been taken from open access policies of publishers, open access policies of funders in particular. And then to ensure that this actually works, we've got three sections on oversight, compliance, and enforcement. On the right, a photograph of Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States, whose foreign policy and diplomacy strategy was to speak softly and carry a big stick. And that, I think, is the main strategy behind oversight, compliance, and enforcement in our bill. The Higher Education Authority, which is one of the funders of NORF, who are one of our funders, has the power to oversee national policies or objectives with respect to higher education, and we propose making the achievement of the obligations and rights in our bill, which is to say the open access provisions, a matter of national policy for the purposes of the HEA. There is also the Irish Research Agency, which has the power, the objects to promote and support the contribution made by research and innovation and to strengthen the engagement of the research and innovation system with society. Well, because it's got that object, we suggest that the agency may, when it is setting up its funding schemes, and it's one of the primary funders of research in Ireland, specify open access, consider the extent to which principal investigators have in the past achieved open access and how they intend to achieve open access for the publications of this funding. They can specify that in the award, and they can more generally promote open access. They also have a compliance mechanism, a stick, in sections 40 to 46 of their Research and Innovation Act, which ensures that when there are conditions relating to their awards, and in this case, open access would be a condition, there are reports about those conditions, and those conditions are met, or funding is withdrawn or prevented. And there are other public funding bodies, and the remainder of Section 9 ensures that the same kinds of structures that apply in respect of the Irish Research Agency, tied to Eoin, can also apply in respect of the other funding bodies. And who else carries a stick, and is it a big stick? Well, there is a public body called the Ombudsman, and that has oversight across the general delivery of public services, and an employee who is in an institution which, for example, might decide not to believe in this bill, not to believe in this obligation, can make a complaint to the Ombudsman, and the Ombudsman then has investigatory and compliance powers. And the employee can do this without prejudice to other rights and means of redress the employee might have. I'm going very briefly to point out that we think our draft legislation meets recommendations of best practice across Europe in particular. My son's favorite singer is George Ezra. His first single was Budapest. And it reminded me of the Budapest Open Access Initiative, which was published first on the 14th of February 2002. And several of its primary recommendations have underpinned subsequent further open access publications, including that research should be freely accessible, given to the world without expectation of payment. At least in this respect, this is in our definition of open repository, which makes it available without charge to and without payment to the researchers. It permits users to use these publications for any lawful purpose without financial, legal, or technical barriers. We specify this in Section 4, that it can be used or reused, that it can be used without payment, without cost to users either way. and by means of self-archiving or open access journals or other means. And we think our open repository and open public license comes within at least the other means. So the FAIR principles are reflected in the draft bill because the draft bill ensures that the publicly funded research outputs are findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable because it's published in an open repository in an open format on foot of an open license. It's accessible generally. It's an open repository, but it's accessible also to people with disabilities. It's made available in an interoperable fashion, and there are no conditions on reuse. And when we look at the bill, we see that it is trying to be as open as possible and as closed as necessary. So that, for example, Section 4 in defining the obligations and rights relating to the making available of publicly funded research outputs is as open as possible. But there are requirements in sections 5 and 6 relating to arts practice and exceptions, limitations, and postponements that are necessary. And we've tried to draw that line and get this balance as well as we can. And so the All European Academies recent definition of open access publication is reflected in the draft bill as well. The subject matter is as wide as possible. There is no embargo. If a publicly funded research output has not been available by the institution, by the employer, before it is about to be formally published, then we specify that it needs to be published as soon as possible. So there is no formal embargo. There might be an individual postponement, but only for so long as is necessary. So there is no generally applicable embargo, but there might need to be some individual accommodations. There's a whole range of rights of authorized publication. It's got to be as wide and as open as possible. The rights to publish are as binding as possible. And in particular, Section 4 of our bill proposes that where there is a right or obligation under our bill, it cannot be overridden by any subsequent contract. And there are no other conditions permissible apart from the acknowledgement of the location of first publication where practicable. And then recently we have had the Barcelona Declaration on open research information, and all of these commitments are reflected. Again, we're making openness the default, open public license without charge. The requirement that the ecosystem support and enable open research information. Well, the primary obligation here is on the employer to make the research output available by means of an open repository, and this creates a workflow on the part of the employer, where there is an employer, obviously. Supports sustainable infrastructures for open research information, a robust and trusted open repository. And importantly, we have added obligations to ensure that once something is published in the repository, it can't be taken down. If the repository itself is about to go offline, it's got to transfer its open publications to another suitable open repository before it goes offline. And then the collective action across the HEA and Research Ireland and the Ombudsman, as we have already described. Now that we have a bill that we think is as fair as possible, we have to persuade across a wide range of locations, including middle row left column, government and policy-making organizations. And that's what we're undertaking now. We had an election just before Christmas. one of the things that Arushi had to do, beyond trying to talk me down from some of my more extended madnesses in research definitions, was to contact all of the candidates in our general election, to our lower house, the Dáil, and our upper house, the Seanad. And we had several rounds of engagement with candidates, referring them to our bill in the hope that we would persuade them to introduce it in a programme for government. And we are now seeking a meeting with the relevant minister in the hope that we can persuade that department to take it up. If we can't persuade the department to take it up, we have a number of non-government members of parliament at both the Dáil and the Seanad level, who, by virtue of our engagement with them, are prepared to take it. So we will be trying to push it either on the government side or on the backbench side. A question that I often get asked is, how long will this take? And the answer is, how long is a piece of string? I was involved in a major piece of copyright reform. We reported in 2013, and the bill partly implementing our report was published in 2019, and this was a reform the government wanted. So something they may not want but are persuaded to undertake, they might not proceed even as slowly as that. Okay, so thank you all very much for listening. I see that there are questions in the chat, and I'm sure there are other questions as well. I'm delighted that Arushi and Martin are here. Arushi, as I say, was a researcher on this part of the project, and Martin was an advisor in this part of the project. And so if there are any questions I can't answer, Arushi and Martin, I hope, will be able to save my blushes. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Eoin. Arushi, could I just ask for your kind of reflections on the process, where we are in the political cycle, anything that you want to pick up on Eoin's presentation?
Well, to be honest with you, all of you who are present here today, it hasn't been a smooth journey, to be honest. Recently, we've just, like, even in the February version itself, we had to brainstorm about what to still keep in the bill and what to take out. In fact, Owen, if you can vaguely recall our meeting 2 weeks ago, about 2 weeks ago, we were just discussing it with the team, and they had like a lot of feedback as to the term publicly funded, and we were still like, it's still a draft, as Owen likes to say. Nevertheless, it's like I said, it's not a smooth journey per se. And thanks for giving me the stage, Ben. I would like to say a few remarks, if that's all right with everyone. I'm not sure how many of the participants know this, but KR21 did give us a grant as well recently, and because of KR21, we were able to deliver our additional outputs, and all this communications with the politicians and the work that we're trying to do has been made possible because of this funding that we received recently. Those are the kind of reflections that I have at the moment for you. And Owen already pointed out earlier that we're still discussing this with the politicians, and it takes time sometimes, because, you know, elections have just like passed in December. We had the Prime Minister taking the office a few weeks ago, and it's just difficult to reach out to people who are doing a lot more in their fields to take a look at the bill that we've come up with, and which I'm sure that everybody understands. I think that's about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Arushi. I've got a couple of questions myself. Perhaps we'll sort of start off with those, and then we can move to those in the Q&A. And participants, please put further questions in. So I particularly liked the linkage with the regulatory obligations of the Higher Education Authority and the Irish Research Agency. I think kind of embedding it in their roles and responsibilities is an excellent provision. I've got two detailed questions, Owen. I think you did sort of cover it off, but perhaps if we could dig in a little bit further. So question one is, how does the bill deal with the norm of assignment to the publishers? So the author, for example, signs away their copyright to the publisher. I think it was in there, but it would be good to tease that out a bit more. And I'm also interested in how it deals with embedded works in an article, for example.
Okay. Ask me easy questions, why don't you? But yeah, we do have to face these things. Okay, so the first one is this. Authors and or their employers own copyright in what they produce. They then transfer, and I'm going to use transfer as a neutral word for a second, to the publishers, and the publishers work their magic and generate their subsequent intellectual property. The bill is drafted so that right up until the publishers step in, everything that is produced by the author and the institution is and continues to be the property of the author and the institution. And anything produced afterwards by the publisher is the property of the publishers. If the publishers seek to put a clause in that extends their rights by saying anything that existed before they came into the picture is also theirs, that is incompatible with the Act and is therefore, according to Section 4.1 of the Act, 4.1d of the Act, a void clause. The publishers can't claim more than the Copyright and Related Rights Act 2000 already gives them. And so there are publisher clauses out there where they either say you must transfer everything before us, or in some cases, in a very weasel sort of way, we're going to be nice. We're going to let you keep some of the stuff before us. Whether they're being honest and saying, give it to us, or whether they're being dishonest and asserting that they own it and then giving a bit back, either way, that is void according to Section 4.1d. As for embedded resources, that causes a lot of problems already, in the sense that where there is an existing resource that has its own copyright restrictions being used in an open access research output, or at least being used in a research output, there are lots of third-party apps that create, I don't know, diagrams for scientific outputs, for example. And some of those claim rights in the outputs created with them. And that creates problems. And those problems are just specific to that kind of process. We acknowledge that if there is a third-party IP, first, there should be a means to obtain permission or an exception. But if there is a third-party IP and there isn't means to obtain permission or an exception, we have to recognize and respect that third-party IP. But what that means is that researchers are going to have to get clever to ensure that when they are generating the diagrams in the scientific output, for example, that they are capable of reuse and are not restricted in this way. We can't really interfere in those circumstances, but this kind of workflow will encourage to ensure that those third-party IPs don't have an impact. That was your first question, and because I've taken so long to answer it.
That was both of them, yeah.
Oh, that was both of them. Okay.
Yes, I suppose on the embedded works, I've always assumed that what we can bring into play is the quotation exceptions that
yes,
exist.
I mean, we specifically say that exception, we're directing people to look to exceptions, and in some jurisdictions, quotation is quite a robust exception. In others, not so much. I mean, there are lots of research education and quotation exceptions, but I wouldn't want to be relying on them as a matter of course.
Thank you, Eoin. So if we now perhaps turn to the questions in the Q&A, and please, if colleagues have got questions, please put them in the Q&A. So for question number one, to both of you, why do research outputs need to be assigned a DOI specifically, rather than another type of persistent identifier, such as a handle or archival resource key ARK?
Well, the answer is that I was simply putting up a short part of what is quite a long subsection, which talks about identifiers in general and gives DOI as an example. But in the same way as we have open public licenses in general, and the way that has been implemented elsewhere gives Creative Commons licenses as an example and in particular. So we're not trying to restrict it to DOIs. There will be local contexts where other types of identifiers, like a handler archival resource key there, will be more appropriate. And that will fulfill the obligation as well. It's just that if there isn't anything for the purposes of, findability, accessibility, and so on, a DOI or equivalent is useful.
Thank you. So I don't know, Arushi, do you want to add anything on that?
That just pretty much sums up the answer, actually.
Great,
Yeah.
great. Thank you. A very good question now. If academic freedom is allowed to be one of the escape clauses for getting out of open access compliance, won't some researchers make Weasley excuses under the banner of academic freedom to pointlessly postpone the making of their work open access? Is this a cart and horses?
No, it's not, for two reasons. First of all, it's a postponement. It's not an exception. It's not a limitation. It's only a postponement. And you have to make your postponement argument on an individual basis to your Dean of Research. You still have the obligation to put it into the repository. And when you're putting it in, you make your application for your postponement to your Dean of Research. The Dean of Research has to be persuaded that there is an imperative requirement of overriding public interest, imperative and overriding are heavy. You have to make your case about academic freedom. Oh, it's against my academic freedom for my work to be made available open access is a very weaselly and therefore unpersuasive argument. If an institution has an institutional commitment to open access, you have to establish your individual exception. Academic freedom is recognized in, for example, the open access publication requirements in the research assessment exercise in the UK and in some of the open access language from the European Commission. But what UK institutions are finding is that where an individual makes an individual application for an individual postponement, first of all, there are very few. And secondly, they are rarely strong enough beyond a certain degree of hand-wringing on the part of the researcher. Can I bring to answer in this part of the question, one of the questions that has come up subsequently from a researcher engaged in research on sensitive issues who wants to restrict. Yeah, who wants to restrict for ethical grounds. Well, this is a postponement for ethical reasons, and there are quite extensive provisions in the bill relating to ethical obligations of researchers, of their co-authors, of their institutions, of the funders. And you would make it in the same way. You would put it into the repository. When you're putting it into the repository, you would ask your Dean of Research, can we please postpone? And for ethical reasons, once you've demonstrated them, those are the most common kinds of reasons. That and, I don't know, making sure that you're not publishing defense secrets or something are the most common kinds of reasons for postponements. And if they don't time out, they don't time out. But if they do time out, then it gets published afterwards. So it's not these grounds, first of all, have to be imperative and overriding, and they only apply for so long as that reason is applicable, and then they get published thereafter. We are aware that the phrase suggests coach and horses, suggests weasel words, but when you see that it is nested in limited exceptions, I think it becomes clear that it's going to be very hard for somebody who just for whatever reason wants to stop things going out. They just can't say, oh, it's my research ethics, or oh, it's my academic freedom. You actually have to establish it.
Thank you. I think that really highlights the fact that you've gone quite deep into the workflow around this.
Yeah.
And of course, each institution will have its own different flavors on that on the required workflow, but actually stipulating, I think, at this level, the what sort of opt-outs or postponements are possible and what the process is, I think is going to create uniformity across Ireland when it's
Over
introduced.
time, yes,
Yeah.
that is the plan. And the thing is that I will just reiterate that most of the Irish institutions are committed to open access. The two representative bodies for the Irish higher education space reacted very positively to our proposals. So it will be pushing very much against the tide to try to stand on dignity and say, don't publish.
Thank you, Anders. Arushi, do you want to add anything?
Not on this one, but I see a very interesting question. I'm kind of excited how Eoin would like to answer the next one about cyber attacks, because that is something that I think we haven't discussed when it comes to the bill. Eoin.
Not in as many words, no, and we're going to have to go back and look at it in that respect.
Yeah.
The question is, in the light of damaging cyber attacks on HEIs that have taken repositories offline for months, MTU Cork, and it's not just MTU Cork, all of the Irish HEIs have been on the receiving end of cyber attacks, some more successful in public than others. Have we been thinking about redundancy? Yes, we have, though not specifically for cyber attack reasons. The Section 4 of the bill says that an employer of an employee must, but employers of co-authors, funders may, and there are several republication rights allowed. So we're trying to push it out as far as possible. So, for example, a general repository might decide to republish a lot of these things. Funders and authors and their institutions are likely to have repositories. And we did say that if we know that a repository is going offline, they have to try and find somewhere else to publish before they go offline. So by virtue of making it as open as possible, we're encouraging as much redundancy as possible, but that's about as far as we can go in the bill. There's an awful lot more that needs to be filled in practice around open access policies in institutions and around the practices of the various repositories in terms of sharing, in terms of redundancy, in terms of cross-publication, and so on. Multiple independent repositories, not just one. Yes, I mean, we have an obligation in respect of one, and then we have rights in respect of all of the others. And our hope is that the sector will see the need for the redundancy. And because it's an open license, other repositories will be able to take it.
Arushi, your finger went up there.
I just wanted to add, perhaps, Eoin, would it be wise if we were to add a very specific example like this in the bill? Because I was just thinking, because of the language and the workflow that we have in Section 4, so specifically adding this would mean that there could be a number of specific instances that we may not have foreseen, because, you can never really be completely sure about stuff. So if we were to include this specific thing in the bill, would it not be that we're ignoring the rest of the episodes that could take place in the future? Does that make sense?
Well, I mean, there's always the problem that once you add a specific example in
Exactly.
legislation, it
Yeah.
has an impact on adjacent issues. I think we are going to have to think about pointing a little more to the fact of cross-publication and redundancy in the sector.
I'll make a note of that just
Yeah.
to kind of add that to the presentation.
Aileen, who is the researcher engaged in research on sensitive issues, um, says, what if I can't find a repository willing to take your research? For example, perhaps I want the repository to postpone, but there aren't repositories who have this type of functionality. Well, um, the they will have to provide that type of functionality when the bill comes in, if and when the bill uh, comes into effect. Now, as I say, there's quite a long time before the bill is likely to be taken up politically, let alone advance through the legislative process and implemented. So this will be a significant lead time for uh, institutions that are creating their open repositories to ensure that their repositories have the functionality required under the bill. And there are lots of borderline questions along when is something that is co-funded between, say, arts and research funders. What line does it go under? And the answer is, again, by virtue of the lead time, they will be able to make their decisions accordingly. Two final questions, if to respond to. The first is,
Can I just jump in, because Martin in the chat has actually
yes.
it raised a question in response to Aileen saying, is it fair to say there's a distinction between research outputs as defined in the bill and research data? For instance, there would not be a requirement to publish anything subject to ethical restrictions in an open repository that would not otherwise be published, for example, in a journal.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I was going to pick up on that and just generalize it. If you have sensitive personal data, and you don't have consent to publish or any other basis on foot of the GDPR to process by publication, then you can't publish it anyway. So you're not even in an individual postponement, you're in a general limitation. There are lines between research data and publicly funded research outputs that researchers are navigating all the time. And anybody publishing or anybody dealing with underlying research data sets that have personal information in them know of the GDPR restrictions. It's just that there are some ethical restrictions beyond the legal restrictions that have to be accommodated as well. And the legal restrictions kick in and you can't publish. The ethical restrictions kick in and you just have to respect the extent of the ethical obligations. And then million-dollar question, how do we protect open access from AI harvesting and reuse? Well, there is the legal answer and then there's the practical answer. The legal answer is this. If the most of the AI harvesting at the moment is being done in breach of copyright, in breach of terms of service, in breach of terms and conditions of websites. And it is clear that where material is being made available on foot of a Creative Commons license, all of the harvesting that is happening is also in breach of the Creative Commons licenses. There is a relatively narrow exception provided by European law for text and data mining. But if you have in something like your top level text that says don't crawl for text and data mining, you can indicate that this is not something that can be reproduced for this kind of purpose. So the legal answer is there already are legal provisions that prevent this. The practical answer is, well, at the moment they're crawling anyway. It's going to take a big case. There are a couple bubbling in Germany. There are 30-something bubbling in the US. There's at least one starting in the UK, which will clarify the extent of the applicability of those legal rules, and we will see compliance in the future. We don't have compliance yet, but by the time the repositories come on board or come online to meet the obligations in our bill, those legal obligations and those practical obligations, I am confident, will be as sorted out as they're ever going to be.
I suppose, just turning that question on the head, do we not want to facilitate organizations of all types and sizes to train on high quality, good material in order to ensure that we can support science, we minimize bias, we ensure the models are good. So, you know, I see that these secondary publishing right type laws as a way of actually increasing the quality and type of AI models that can be produced.
Yes, and harvesting on foot of the terms of the Creative Commons license will allow that. It is only where you get harvesting beyond the terms of the license and beyond the terms of the text and data mining exception that that things are going to run into problems. For so long as your publication making available, permitting use and reuse on foot of the Creative Commons license is there, I think your concerns, with which I completely agree, will be properly met. It's just to ensure that it's not being done for exclusively commercial purposes by the Sam Altmans of this world.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So
now, sorry that the video was a problem for the last few minutes, but I think I've just solved it.
Right. So I think we are out of questions. So unless anyone quickly wants to put a question in the chat, I will say, first of all, that the overriding impression is that you've put, as a team, an awful lot of effort into coming up with a very robust law which covers off multiple scenarios in, I think, a very fair and balanced way. And as I said earlier on, I think the way that you've placed it within the roles, responsibilities, and obligations of the funders, so you're embedding it in university practice, as well as going, as we discussed with the opt-out question from Aileen, as well as going to that level of specificity to create uniformity across Irish universities in the way that author rights retentions, where in the UK we see each institution having a different formula. I think, you know, that will create uniformity. So I would congratulate all three of you, including Martin, who unfortunately we can't see, for an absolutely excellent piece of work. And, you know, I think we're all praying that your government sees sense and decides to implement it, rather than you having to go the backbench route, which will be more complex and time consuming, I suspect. So yes, so I think, thank you.
Fingers crossed in the next few weeks for that stage of the work. And I just want to drop in and say again that we are very grateful to Knowledge Rights 21 for Martin's input and for Arushi's funding, because we could not have gotten off the ground or gotten to the stage that we are without it. So we're very grateful indeed.
And I suppose in turn, I would like to thank Arcadia, who I mentioned at the beginning, who's made the whole program possible. So yes, so we all have our fingers crossed, and we very much look forward to some success, hopefully later in the year or next. So again, yeah, thank you very much indeed for an absolutely excellent presentation.